Okay, so I usually wait until after I lecture to pass out the grade sheets. And actually, you guys were lucky because I didn't finish this morning, but you get your grades today. This morning was supposed to get them today, but it's a lot more grading than I'm used to. Anyway, so a lot of you have never been in one of my classes before, and you've never gotten a grade sheet before, and for some reason, people find them confusing. So I like to spend a little bit of time and talk about what's on the grade sheet and what it means, and why you shouldn't panic yet, or maybe why you should panic. So we have several different bars that all come together. The most important one is obviously the one that has your grade in it, right? The one with the dotted line around it has your current grade in the class. The blue stuff above is the class average grade. Okay? This happens to not be for this class. It was for a different class, so that's not the grade right now. But I like to point this out. So the blue above is the class average. You're in black below. That's your current grade. Okay? Now, it's a little bit unfair right now because the comments are counting way more than they should. Right? By the end of the semester, the comments count for 5% of your overall grade. But thus far, you basically have comments and you have one assignment. The assignment's worth 7% and the comments are worth 5%. So it's not really fair yet. Does that make sense? So the comments are much less. Okay, so right here, right, we have a little column called comments. Whatever the number is right here is the number that I think you should have. Okay, which, somebody, let me borrow one, right, is 21 right now. If you don't have anything down here, right, that might be a problem. Or you're missing some comments, or maybe I have an error in my spreadsheet. That could happen too. I might not have caught it. Okay? It'll give you your total number and what percentage that is of what you should have. Okay? If you're not seeing it there, you may also see it down here under participation. Right? Maybe. Up here in the assignments category, you'll have your grade for your assignment 101. Right? And obviously, as it fills in, there are a bunch of zeros right now, but you'll end up with a grade in each one of those columns as you go forward. This is also assignment 101 with your grade, and then I've written some kind of a comment about your particular work. Okay? So if for some reason you don't understand what I said, come ask me and we'll talk about it. Right? But I try to give you some feedback about it, and I try to have targeted feedback. I try not to. I was talking to somebody this morning, and I was lamenting my grading, trying to get through all 60-something of you. And they were saying, well, don't you have a set cut of cut and copy comments? Well, the truth is I have no cut and copy comments. Every once in a while, two are close enough to where I'll copy them, but I generally add a couple sentences afterward that explain something specific. So I don't have generic comments. They are specifically, when I'm looking at yours, I give you your comments. Okay? These ones, obviously, even though you turned in 102 today, it's going to say 0 because I haven't looked at it yet, and it's going to say no comments yet. Okay? The exercises, right? This is going to tell you your total percentage. It's also a bar up above, right? Your percentages are below. You should see a bunch of hundreds. That's what you want. If there's any zeros, they're probably highlighted in red, meaning, wait a minute, you forgot something, or you forgot to turn it in. Don't panic, right? Just turn it in. Right? I'll go back and I'll catch it. Okay? The other thing that happens is it'll probably have a hole for assignment 10 or exercise 109 right now. That's because the morning class had 109. You haven't had 109 yet. Doesn't matter. I'm not going to mark it late because it's not on your sheet. You will find that sometimes there's a delay, or whenever I grade, maybe you posted it right after I graded or whatever. If you have a hole that's right at the end of your exercise bar, wherever we currently are in the class, don't worry about it. It'll fill in afterward. Okay? If you turn something in and I have you marked as a 0, please tell me, wait a minute, I turned that in, because I'm only human, I make mistakes. Right? That's part of why I give you the grade sheet, so you can go back and say, wait a minute, I should have, it shows that I turned it in, I have it there, will you go back and check? Okay? Does that kind of make sense for how it plays out? Right? The upper bars is always the average. Right? So in the exercises, for example, in this particular example, you could see in exercise 101, 97% is the average, which means probably one person in the class didn't turn it in. Right? You got 100 in this case. And then as you go forward, you see that, yes, this particular example, they were all turned in. Does that make sense? I just want to make sure we're clear. If your grade is lower than you want it to be, two things. One, you probably didn't do enough comments, right? Or two, you probably didn't turn something in. both of which you can fix. Okay, so turn it in. If you're unhappy with your assignment 101 grade, remember you can do one resubmit on that assignment by the end of the semester. Okay? But remember also that I will not regrade it until the end of the semester. So that grade is going to stay there until the very end. Okay? And those of you that have been in my class before, you get the program, you get what this says. Okay? So it may take a little bit to get used to, but that's essentially what you're doing. I do try to highlight things that are missing. So like if you're looking at your exercise bar, you guys can't read this, it's too far away, right? You see all the yellow? Well, that's after, right? We haven't done those yet. But if you have in your initial bar here of where I have numbers and you have a yellow square, and chances are you're missing that. You need to go back and fix that. Okay? All right, so hopefully that's clear. So you guys got 2 handouts today. You got exercise 109, which we'll talk about in depth as you go forward, or as we go forward today, which is essentially your introduction to InDesign, and we're going to talk about kind of the basics and how do you work in InDesign. My guess is that a lot of you have been forced into InDesign. Certainly if you're in 121, you were forced into it already. But hopefully I can still provide some quality input on how you learn InDesign. My guess is that I probably can. You also got the next assignment handed out, which is assignment 103, which of course I can't seem to place my hand on here. Assignment 103 is to do a lecture series poster for a bunch of visiting architects who are going to come and talk to us here. Okay? You can use the projected schedule for this semester. You can look up last year's lecture schedule and use that. Or you can make up any of your own architects or people that are going to come and talk to us. Right? I don't care what the content says. I care how it's presented to me. Does that make sense? Okay? So you're going to be responsible for creating that lecture series, whatever it is, and talking people into coming to the lecture series, okay, by your poster. We will talk a lot. You guys right now don't have the skills to do this yet, or maybe you think you do, but I don't think you do yet. So we're going to make sure that you cover a lot before that. You'll notice that it's due on March 9th, which is quite a ways away, a couple weeks away. Okay? So nothing to panic about yet, but I like to kind of give you, hey, here's what's coming. And you notice that today you got your grade back for assignment 101, you turned in assignment 102, and you now got your assignment 103. Okay? So when we move forward and you turn in 103, you'll get your grade back for 102, and you'll get your 104. Does that kind of make sense for how I structure the class? Okay? A little bit different than 136 because there's such long gaps in the 136 assignments, right? We have an assignment for like 4 weeks or something. So it's a little different, it's a little quicker pace. Okay? So that's assignment 103. It'll be an 11 by 17. You will post it and print it like you've been doing, and I'll collect the prints so that I have a record of the prints the same way we've been doing it. Okay? So today we're going to talk not so much demonstration, but actual lecture. And we're going to talk about graphic design in its kind of infancy phases. Right? When you're just learning to be a designer, we're going to talk about that stage of things. And kind of the design process. And it's really easy to come up with a lecture just on graphic design, but it's also easy to extrapolate the things that I'll talk about relating to graphic design today right into architectural design or industrial design. So this, while it's specific to graphic design, right, applies to all the other fields of design that are related. And I think at this early stage in your career as a student, looking at design as a whole is not a bad thing. So it doesn't matter whether you're going to end up being an industrial designer or a graphic designer or an architectural designer, whatever it is that you're going into, this kind of infancy phase of design is still very much the same. So the function of design is the communication of messages through a juxtaposition of words and pictures, right? And I should specify this is the function of graphic design. Remember, this lecture is about graphic design. Right? So it's the juxtaposition of words and pictures, so text and some kind of visual elements that we're going to somehow communicate a message. Right? Let's think about the poster for a second. Right? I need to communicate something about the lecture series to you. So the images maybe cause you to be interested in the poster, and then there's a bunch of information like who's going to lecture, where's it going to be, what time is it going to be, that kind of stuff. Right? And so I'm providing that to somebody. Okay? In a way, it's the visual synthesis of thought. So we, as designers, always have to find a way to communicate our ideas to somebody, right? And those ideas can be an experiential thing, right? We might make something. Maybe in the world of architecture, we make a building. We have an idea about how the sun is going to come into a building, and we make that, right? And then people can experience it. So it's a way of synthesizing what we thought, which is kind of what makes it fun, okay? In terms of design objectives, these would be objectives of a graphic design piece. If I hid this list and made us go through and kind of come up with these, my guess is that you could come up with almost all of them, okay? Because they're rather obvious. So guidance or persuasion, certainly. Encouragement, communication, communicating one thing to another. Maybe motivating you to go do something, right? Educating you. Certainly the book, which could be considered a graphic design piece by itself, is educating you about digital tools for architects, right? So it could be educational. Could be to inspire some kind of a dialogue. Could get you talking, right? Something like that. Maybe it's controversial, right? Inspiration, promotion of something, right? Selling something, billboards, right? Those are all graphic design products, okay? Awareness, right? Directions, right? Entertainment. And of course, I can't resist throwing things in. The end result of this semester is going to be a portfolio of work. So when I show graphics, I tend to show examples that are kind of in line with what you'll ultimately be creating. So I have lots of portfolio type things. I have lots of poster type things that I'll show as part of this because I can't resist. Establishing function, and that is, what is the purpose of the design? Okay? Is it an invitation? Right? Are you inviting somebody to a birthday party? Right? Is it a poster? Right? Obviously, we're going to do the lecture series, inviting somebody to come to a lecture. Right? Is it going to be a book? Right? What is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this in the first place? And what is the primary objective of doing the graphic design? Right? Lecture series, get people to come to the lecture. Right? Book cover, get people to read the book. Right? Does that kind of make sense? So if we think about it in that context, that's a big problem we have to solve. Right? We have to figure out how to do whatever it is that we need to do as the function of this design. Obviously, who the intended audience is also relevant. Right? Maybe you're trying to inspire people to come to an architecture lecture, and the people that you're trying to inspire are students, and they might be students that are specifically interested in architecture. What you put on that poster may be more relevant to them than, say, a math major on campus. Right? So your target audience are students that are interested in design. Right? Maybe you could look at it as, you know, the demographics of some advertiser trying to get certain people interested in it. Maybe they're looking at the 18 to 24 demographic. They're going to do something specific from a design standpoint to address that particular demographic of people. Those are the people they're interested in. Okay? That's the audience. And what is the desired reaction? You know, go buy something, go to the lecture, whatever it is. There's usually a desired reaction. It's the designer's responsibility to create strong communicative experiences that support the function of the design on behalf of the client and for the viewer. So 3 prongs. Right? We have the design itself, and that's on behalf of the client. That's the person who's paying for it or requesting that you do it. And it's for the viewer, the person who's looking at it. Right? So we have those 3 elements that are constantly kind of interacting with each other and causing this to become good or bad design. Okay? So we have to think about those 3 approaches. The client and the viewer could be the same thing, could be the same person, or they might be separate. In the graphic design realm, they're almost always separate. In the architectural design realm, they're almost always the same. Right? I guess if you were doing a library or a big commercial project, they would be different in the architectural world. But if you were doing, say, a residential house, it's almost always the client is the person who's going to move into the house. Okay? So what are some skills designers need to have? Again, this is a list that if we sat down and we tried to come up with it, you could probably come up with this on your own. But analysis, perception, right? Communication abilities, research, right? Management, maybe. Problem solving is probably the biggest one on this list. And I think it's really important to understand that part of the reason a degree in architecture in the first place is such a valuable degree to have is because we teach you so much about thinking critically and solving problems in creative ways, right? And so let's compare the architecture major to the history major for just a second. No offense, anybody a history major here? Oh, good. Okay, I can bash on them, right? My best friend actually is a history major from Berkeley. So anyway, so I'm going to bash on history majors for a second. Okay, you go through college and you become a history major and you learn all this stuff about history. Okay, is that really teaching you to think critically about solving creative problems? Probably not, right? You might have a lot of background and context and precedent to solve a problem, but you're not necessarily thinking about how to be creative and how to solve a problem. Architecture, on the other hand, is constantly giving you problems, right? Constantly giving you things to figure out, right, that don't have a scripted answer, right? In the math world, for example, you might get a problem that you have to solve, but there's generally a route to which you solve it, right? You go in a certain set of steps and you solve that problem. In architecture, there is no set of steps for you to follow to get a solution. So you have to learn to create that on your own out of the blue. And that's part of what makes architecture majors so good, right, when they're out in the world after college, right? Part of the reason that the half of the people that don't graduate with a degree, who graduate with a degree in architecture who don't practice architecture end up being very successful people anyway, okay? Because of this critical thinking, problem-solving ability that we're cultivating. And that's the nature of design. Anyway, enough of that tangent. Visualization, composition, dialogue, organization, right? You get these ideas. So let's talk a little bit about inspiration in the first place. And so, how many people have ever been working on some kind of a design project and felt stuck? Right? If you've been in the design world and you don't raise your hand right now, you're lying. Right? Chances are you have been stuck. And that's normal. Okay? But there's this thing that's called inspiration that sits there that causes you to get unstuck. And you have to cultivate this, right, in some manner such that you feel inspired and you can always be doing something new and always be working on something, right? If you're feeling stuck, something's wrong and you need to change it. So how do we nurture this inspiration? First thing is to be aware of your surroundings, right? It's really easy when you've been staying up night after night after night and you haven't had any sleep to just kind of like trudge into class and like, okay, I made it. And let's just kind of veg out while he's talking, right? It's easy. And I can see it in your eyes, right? As much as I try to make what I'm talking about interesting, I can see you guys like, oh yeah, I'm here. You're right? I can see that happening. That does happen. I know it does because you're tired. But if you're active and if you're thinking, right, and if you're observing what's going on, little bits of inspiration are going to trickle into your brain and you're not going to be stuck anymore, right, when you need it. It's things like walking along and seeing, like this morning. Okay, way too early for me to be here. I was walking up to get my copies on campus, okay? And I was walking in front of the library, and at that particular moment, the sun was very, very low on the horizon. It had just come up, right? And it was shining almost horizontally across the concrete of that particular, the way the hill comes up and the concrete was. So it was illuminating the very edges of all the pieces of concrete, right? It was a really cool effect that had to do with how I was walking and kind of understanding the material and seeing the texture. It was really interesting, right? If I wasn't aware and if I was just trudging up there like, I gotta go get my copies, I wouldn't have seen that and I wouldn't have used that maybe down the road when I'm designing a wall and I want light to wash this wall in a certain way, right? That could be an inspiring thing. It might be inspiring to me, it might not be to you, but if you're aware of your surroundings, you will have those moments where you feel that inspiration, and that's important. Okay? So you just need to be open-minded. You need to be aware of what's going on. Right? It's found and transformed into tangible objects. Right? It might be something that you see and then you do a sketch of it. Right? Or you do something to remember it. Right? The other thing is it can be completely different, right, depending on where you are and who's experiencing something. Right? So if Daniel and I go to the same lecture, right, and we see Tom Main talk, okay, I might be really interested in something he did about the skin of a building, and you might be really interested in what he did about how he structured the building. Okay? We went to the same lecture, we saw the same talk, but you were inspired by the structure and I was inspired by the skin.
That's normal. That's okay, right? So just because we saw the same thing doesn't mean that we have the same things that are focused on the inspiration. We pick up on different details, and that's part of why you need to be around people that are inspiring to be around. It shouldn't be a chore or require any extra effort. Okay? One of the things about being an architecture major that's utterly fantastic is that we get to do design all the time. Okay? So I'm going to pick on the history majors again, and I'll pick on my best friend who was a history major at Cal when I was an architecture major. We lived together. We were roommates. And I would come home at like 3 in the morning, right, after working in studio, and he would roll out and look out his door and like, oh, you're home. He's like, oh, you missed out on this party, and we went to dinner, and how on earth could you possibly want to be an architecture major? Because you always miss out on all this stuff. And I would turn around and I'd say, well, wait a minute. How on earth would you want to be a history major? You have to write papers and read books all day. I get to draw and build models. That's all I do, right? So if you like the field that we're in, if you like design, if you like doing this sort of thing, right, it shouldn't be a chore or require extra effort to do it because you love to do it anyway, right? If you don't love to do it, you will struggle. If you love to do it, life couldn't be any better, right? To me, it would be the opposite. If I had to read the book and write the history paper, it would be like, oh man, this is horrible, right? So you just have to think about what it is that you love, and it really shouldn't be any extra effort, right? It comes from an innate desire to communicate or express yourself, right? And I think communication is one of those things that's very difficult for people at your level kind of just starting out. Some people are great at talking, right? And they can talk in circles about design and whatever. And there are other people who can't necessarily communicate their ideas but have to show their ideas in another way. So I'll use an example of when I was in grad school, okay? There was, and I hope I haven't already said this example before in this class. It all kind of runs together at some point, but I don't think I have. Okay? When I was in grad school, there was a guy from Korea, Ki-hon. He was awesome, right? He barely spoke English, right? And we came in at the same level in grad school, okay? Some of us, one of my other friends who came from MIT, could probably talk circles around the professors about design theory, right? Way more than I could, right? And Ki-hon couldn't really talk about architecture because he had such a language barrier to it, okay? So he had to show his ideas through his sketches, through his models, and through his design, right? And I would argue that he was every bit as good or better of a designer than the girl that was from MIT who could talk her designs through, right? So it's about communication, not how you communicate, right? So if you have trouble talking about your design, right, find a way to show your design. Does that kind of make sense, right? So it's still about communication, right? The other thing is don't forget to look inward to your inner creativity. If you like to paint, paint. If you like to draw, draw. If you like to shoot photographs, right? That all certainly helps. How many people keep an active sketchbook? How many people have a sketchbook that they're drawing in right now? Okay? Much better show of hands than this morning. This morning I was shocked. There was like 2 people. I was like, what are you doing? Right? So you, in this field, really should have a sketchbook. You should have something that you enjoy drawing in or at least collecting in, right? Some of you feel much more confident drawing, right? Some of you will breeze through 131 and just like, oh, I can draw, right? 131 was not my cup of tea when I took it, right? Drawing was not my thing. I was always nervous to draw because I wasn't kind of the structured, I couldn't just draw a person. Like, that was hard for me, okay? However, when it came to detailing and understanding sections and little bits of things, I was very good at that. So I concentrated my sketchbook on those things that I was good at as I cultivated my skill and got better and better. Now I wouldn't be so afraid to do those drawings, right? The nice thing about a sketchbook is it tends to be something private. So don't be afraid to take risks and just draw, right? That will certainly help. The other thing is sometimes you have disparate little pieces of notes that are like, oh, I drew on a napkin or whatever. Right? Take those and just stick them into your sketchbook. Tape them in, right? Because they're just as valuable as the sketchbook itself. Okay? I think later on in the semester I have some pictures of my sketchbook that I can show you where I have a bunch of stuff that's just taped in. Write notes, make drawings, photograph things, right? Those will help you collect these inspirations so that you can go back and remember whatever it is that you saw, right? You could be walking along, and this is another example, right? I was my wife and I were looking for a new couch, and we were in the room and board store in San Francisco, right, which does nice kind of clean modernist type furniture, beautiful furniture. Anyway, we were looking at couches. And of course, my wife was focused on the couch, right? We had to figure out what the right couch was. And here I was off on a tangent looking at outdoor furniture. I had no need for an outdoor table, but I found this absolutely fantastic outdoor table, and I became obsessed with it. And I want to make this table, right? Because it was something that was inspiring to me. So you have to be aware of those little things. So what did I do? I took a picture of it, and I have the picture, and down the road I'll end up making that table. Or I'll use it as a guide when I do make a table. Okay? So you got to collect to the best of your abilities. So other ways to nurture your inspiration, right? If you carry your sketchbook, notebook, whatever, and or a camera with you, great news, you have a cell phone, it has a camera, use it, right? You would be shocked at all the random pictures that are on my camera, right? I have just bizarre pictures because they're kind of interesting, and why not, right? Space is cheap. You want to become immersed in design, right? Part of the reason that I love to teach as much as I do is because I'm around all of you. Right? And I don't mean that in kind of a sappy sort of way. I mean that because you're in a stage in your careers where design is an open-ended, an open book with blank pages in it. Right? So you, in your creativity, inspire me to do things. And so I like being around you. If I wasn't around you, I wouldn't be around as many people that are interested in design. So you want to be around those people because that will help you get better. Okay? You want to commit to discovering and collecting new ideas. Right? You want to communicate with other designers. A lot of times the best way to get unstuck is to talk about it with somebody else. There's no harm in talking about it. Right? You're all designers together. You're all learning together. If you have an idea for how somebody else can succeed, don't hold it. Give it to them. Right? Let them succeed. Okay? Sometimes you're just so stuck that you need to just get outside and do something. Right? So go take a walk. I know it sounds silly, but it can help a great deal. Right? It's kind of like if you're really, really tired and you need to like go for another hour or another 2 hours, go brush your teeth. Sounds stupid, but it totally works, right? Go wash your hands, that works too, right? Believe me, I did a lot of late nights and I had to do a lot of these, right? Sometimes I might have brushed my teeth more than a few times. But the point is that those kinds of little things can distract you enough to get you going again, right? The other thing that happens is we certainly are in a stage now where we stare at computer monitors for hours and hours and hours on end, right? And have you ever noticed that your eyes start to just like bug out and you can't see anymore? Anybody have that happen? Right? It happens to me. So you have to train yourself to not stay focused on the computer all the time, right? Flick your eyes up, daydream, let it focus, let your eyes focus on the far end of the room for a little while, and you'll be able to work longer with those little itty bitty breaks. Right? It can make a big, big difference. Okay? The other thing is listening to music. You'd be surprised at how much music can really inspire you to move on or create motivation as part of this design field. Your particular choice of music, all right, this is particularly relevant today because we're doing album covers as part of our work. Your particular choice of music may be a little bit unconventional. And part of what I love about the album covers is everybody picks somebody different, right? And everybody has that. So you have to know what works for you. And it might not be something at least in the moment, that you really want to share, right? It might be something that's rather private. But if Taylor Swift really does it for you, then maybe you should be listening to her, right? For me personally, when I was in grad school doing my big modeling sessions, I would sit down to model. This is physical models, right? Gluing things together and whatever. I would sit down to do modeling, and I might not move for 16 hours straight, because I would be so focused and in this zone of doing it. And when I was doing that, I would have headphones on. This was pre like iPod little earbuds. This was like big old like Dr. Dre style, you know. Anyway, I would listen to the Symphony of Metallica album, right? Go figure. Not something that I would normally listen to, but for whatever reason, it really, really worked for me, okay? When I wrote my grad thesis, right, all 80 pages of it or whatever, right, I listened to the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack on repeat for like 3 weeks. Go figure, right? It worked. For whatever reason, it worked. So when you're thinking about trying to do this, right, experiment around with what music works for you, because it can really, really help your productivity, right? And just be aware of that. Explore other areas of interest, attend lectures and conferences and stuff like that. We have a lecture series here that's sponsored by the ACE Club, where they try to bring in visiting people to talk, right? On rare occasions, the person who talks is so boring that it was a waste of time, right? But that's very, very rare. Most of the time, they say something, at least one thing during the lecture that will be interesting and inspiring, right? A lot of times it's more than that. So it's worth going, right, and exploring those kinds of things. Inspiration is always the first step toward the final design, right? You have to have some little spark to go on. And if you're forcing it and you don't have that spark, it won't turn out that well. I don't know, I just think it's funny. So let's talk about the design process. Okay? So the design process starts through this various stages, and we'll talk about each of these stages in a little bit more depth, but we start with research, right? Then we get into information gathering, brainstorming, conceptualization, and/or experimentation. In my mind, those two really go together, and that's when the design really starts to begin, right? Development is when you start to take your ideas and refine them and distill them into something that's real. And then execution is that final draft, right? It's the final draft of your paper. The thing about the design process is you can't skip steps. If you jump to the final product, you won't get there, right? It's just not possible. Design is an iterative thing. You have to do it over and over and over again, and that's how it gets good, right? If you jump to the end conclusion, you've gone there too fast, and there'll be loose ends that you didn't resolve or you didn't think about, right? The iterations are what help you, right? It's an evolution. Every step needs to have your full attention, right? You need to be completely obsessed with it. Like, I'm taking a shower and I'm thinking about my design, right? I'm driving to school and, whoops, better stay in my lane because I was thinking about my design, right? I'm in class and Grant's up here talking and it's really boring. I'm thinking about my design, right? That's part of design school, is constantly being obsessed with it. And that's part of what's fun about it, right? It is totally, totally exhausting to do this, right? Because it's so all-consuming. At the same time, it's the most rewarding thing possible, right? When you get through some kind of a final project and you just nailed it, man, do you ever feel good, right? That's part of it. It's almost addicting. So the program, or the project brief, is the initiation of this design process, right? So it's hard not to talk about an architectural program because that tends to be the easiest thing for you guys to understand. This is the person coming to you and saying, I want you to design me a Calder museum, or I want you to design a house, or I want you to design a whatever. Right? Same thing happens in graphic design, though people tend to be less familiar with it. Somebody comes to you and says, this is what I want you to do. I want you to do a poster. I want you to do the business cards and the logo for this particular company, or whatever it is. Right? And you then have to look at it as a meticulous overview of what you're trying to do. Right? It should address every detail of the design. So everything that you're trying to solve, right? What are all the problems out there, and how are you going to solve them? Right? The design is the solution, but you need to have an outline of what that is. Right? The worst thing that you can do, right, is have somebody come up to you and say, I want you to design a 3-bedroom house. Okay, so Anthony, you go and you design that 3-bedroom house. Okay? You really like modernist design. You did this beautiful modernist house, and you present it to him, and the client says, well, I don't like modern. I like craftsman. Right? Well, it's your mistake because you should have found out more about this. You should have delved into what they really wanted. Right? So you may have solved the problem, I need the 3-bedroom house, but you didn't solve it in a way that was acceptable. So you have to figure out what that is. Right? And that's part of your job as a designer. Right? It's going to also define the roles of you as the designer, the client, what's the client going to do or provide, right? And who is it for, and what is it about, right? So in graphic design, right, you're the designer, you're going to come up with the poster, right? The client is whoever's paying for the poster, right, generally speaking, and the viewer is whoever's you're trying to target with this particular poster, okay? So you're going to begin with the information that's given to you by the client. So in the case of our 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, right, I want a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, right? You're going to clarify and simplify, well, what does a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house really mean, right? How big of a kitchen do you want? How big of a dining room do you want? How many bedrooms or how many living spaces do you want? Is there any, oh, you have a car collection and you need a 16-car garage. Oh, that would be nice to know. You know, whatever it is, you need to find out that information. And the client doesn't always give you all the pieces to the puzzle. Right? It's kind of hard to assemble the 1,000-piece puzzle when you only get 900 of them. Right? So you need those other 100 pieces to figure out how the puzzle really comes together. So you have to clarify and simplify that bit of information. Okay? You're responsible as the designer to ask the questions and get the information. You're going to define the primary goals and the messages to be expressed. So in the case of the poster, the primary goal is get people to go to the lecture. Right? And what are you going to express? Information about those lectures. Right? You also want to define a timetable for completion. Right? How long is it going to take you to do this work? And when is it due? Right? Doesn't do you any good to do a lecture series poster and have it done after the lecture is over. Right? It needs to be up in enough time to get people to go to the lecture. So you need some kind of a deadline. Right? And you want to define who the audience is, certainly. Then you're going to go around and you're going to gather. You're going to collect everything that's relevant to this particular project. Right? So in the case of the poster, what is the lecture series? Who's coming? Where's it going to be? What time is it? That kind of stuff. What about all the images that might inspire you? Are you going to put in images of each of the people that is going to come talk? Maybe, maybe not. Right? You want to gather all that information together so you have it and you can then put it into the design or take it out of the design. If you don't have it, you can't experiment with it. Right? If anything is missing, you need to request it from the client or create it or find out who is supposed to be creating it. Right? Many times, graphic designers get in trouble because they get hired to do a job and the client doesn't actually provide them the content that they're supposed to work with. Right? So maybe you got hired to do a website and that website had a bunch of, or was supposed to have a bunch of information about the company and what they were selling and how their company was structured or whatever. Right? Your job is to put it together and make it look good, but you don't know anything about the company. Right? You're not supposed to write that. Somebody else is. So you need to find out who is and make sure you get that information. That's part of this gathering phase. Right? Then we get into the research or information gathering phase. Right? One of the coolest things about design is that you get to learn a bunch of stuff about other fields. Right? Let's use architecture as an example. Right? One day you might get to design a library. Well, you get to learn everything there is to know about a library. Right? Maybe libraries are your thing, maybe they're not, but you have to think about how are people reading in a library, right? How many books have to be stored in a library? What conditions do the books need to be preserved in, right? Can I put the books on an outer wall or do they have to go inside, right? What kind of fire suppression systems have to be in a library? You learn all this information about a library, right? Then the next project, maybe you're going to design a zoo. We get to learn everything there is to know about a zoo, right? From how do you feed the animals, where are the service roads going to be, to how do you get rid of the elephant's poop, right? You get to learn all that. It's really cool, right? And that's part of the cool thing about design is you learn a bunch of stuff, and you can be kind of interested in that. So you also need, in the graphic design sense, to read and evaluate and understand everything that you're trying to work with, right? If you don't actually read it, right? Let's say you're responsible for putting together a cover for a book. Right? If you didn't read the book, would it be hard to put the cover together for the book? Probably. Right? So you have to do this. This is part of that research phase. Right? Independently research additional information. Right? Google the company. Right? What is the company really about? That sort of thing. Right? Review other materials currently produced by the client. If you're doing a book cover, look at the other books that this client has done. Right? Or has written. Right? Investigate competitive markets, right? Related things. Then we move into brainstorming. This works a little bit more in the graphic design realm than it does in the architecture realm. And that is that you're going to kind of get your ideas out, right? How are you going to organize your information? These can be lists, these can be little trees, hierarchies, outlines, that kind of thing. In the architectural realm, it's little sketches, it's little vignettes, it's little quick ideas about what you're trying to do. Right? Then you get into conceptualization. This is where you formulate a plan for the design. Right? What's it going to start looking at it? It is the thematic link between the design, the function, and the delivery of this product. Okay? And to me, conceptualization and experimentation start to go together. The lines get blurred. And this is the experimentation phase, is where you try stuff out, right? You throw a bunch of stuff out, you see what's there, what's working, what's not, you adjust, you change, right? You try something different, you vary the order, you do all of that stuff to create a better design. So on the handout that I gave you, right, this assignment 103 handout, the poster, the example poster that's on the right here, right, the one with the little tower, right, that was poster number 9 or 10 in his iterative process, right, before he got to that particular poster. So it takes a lot of tries before you really settle on what's right. Okay? Then we get into the execution phase. And this is when you really produce that final product. Right? And at every design, there's a point at which you just have to make it. Right? You have to stop designing, have to stop changing, and you make the final product. Right? And so that's execution. Distilling down the best ideas, going through every single detail and making sure it's right. The other thing that's important is to get yourself out of being attached to the particular object or the particular design, right? I spent so much time on this little thing, it's my little baby, how dare you criticize it, sort of thing, right? If you get yourself out of that and you look at it as if maybe somebody else did it, right? You'll look at it far more critically than thinking about it as this thing that I've been working on for so long, right? How many of you are in 121 right now, right? So you guys have been working on that folding planes thing, right? And so you probably brought it in to Daniel, or you probably brought it into Marlin, and the first thing that they did was they flipped it upside down, or they bent a few things out of place, or they changed a few things, right? Right? Maybe they didn't do it to yours, but they probably did it to some of your friends, right? That is the exact moment that I'm talking about. You can either cringe, I spent so much time on this, or you could say, wait a minute, maybe he has a point. Maybe I should look at it this way. So you're divorcing yourself from the attachment to the object. It's really hard to do, but it's something that you have to practice, right, frequently. You want to analyze objectively. If you can divorce yourself from being attached to the object, you can analyze and say, is it really solving the problem or not? Is it really good or not, right? And then obviously you're producing the final draft. So, intuition. Trusting your inner voice, right? No matter how much you learn the skills, you learn the techniques, right? All that doesn't actually teach you to design, right? So I'm at an unfair disadvantage right now. Both of my classes, 135 and 136, of course I hope I see you all in 136, right? Both of those classes are skill building classes, right? That's what we focus on. How do we work in Photoshop? How do we make a shadow in Photoshop? How do we make it feel realistic, right? That's a skill. I do a little bit of design, right? I teach you a little bit about composition. I can't help myself, right? But this class is about skills more than it is about anything else, okay? But no matter how much you could be the best person at Photoshop collages, right? And if you really didn't understand architecture, or you didn't understand what good design was, no matter how good you can make it look, you won't get there, right? So you have to be able to understand what is good design. And how do we do that? Intuition plays a key role, right? It's a different level of thinking. It's a part of thinking that complements the rational side of things, right? The logic trains, that side of things, this is the opposite of that. This is a gut feeling. It's right, it's wrong, it looks good, it doesn't look good, right? How many people have been in a review of some kind and experienced, right, one of the reviewers saying, it just doesn't feel right. Right? You guys have ever experienced that before? Right? That's really good, right? Those kinds of gut reactions, that is your intuition speaking to you, right? It's not something that you can necessarily put your finger on that says that is perfect, right? It's that it just has the right feel, or it's just not quite there, right? And the more that you learn to trust this, the more that it will guide your design process. And it's kind of fun to have that as the balance to the rational side of things, right? And so you have to nurture this irrational side, this other side, to make it as strong as the rational side, right? It comes naturally, it can't be forced. Like I said, it's kind of this gut feeling. It allows for thoughts that would not come through a rational thought process, right? It's the things that are the whacked out ideas that come from the outside of the box that could be just the right thing for your design project. Could provide guidance, right? It can also provide protection. That's the opposite. That's the, I don't know if I should do that, right? But you have to make sure it's separate from the rational thought of, I don't think I could do that, I should do that because I don't think I'm going to get a good grade. That's different from, it's not going to turn out right, or it's not going to look right. That's very different. So you have to make sure you can separate the rational side, right? The reasoning. It shouldn't have a reasoning, okay? Inspiration, enlightenment, or synthesis. So what are the benefits, right? It really cultivates your imagination. It gets you to think creatively. It gets you outside of the box because it's that driving force that you can't really put your finger on, right? It's the force that leads to the innovative solutions, right? It's that part of the puzzle. It can increase the number of ideas, and it can provide that final spark to push you that last yard to get you there. Big challenges are actually letting it happen, right? So often we get stuck in the rational world that we don't want to take a risk. We don't want to listen to it. We just want to do the safe route, okay? This is the kind of thing where you're in a studio and there's something that's pushing you to do something, and you could either succeed to your wildest expectations or it could flop miserably, right? And you don't know which it is, right? This is the thing that separates people that are happy just getting a B or happy just getting by from the people who really want to go for it, right? And some people want to go for it and some people don't, okay? But the best designers out there are the people that go for it, the people that leap off the cliff, so to speak, right? And trust this intuition. It takes a lot of time to trust this intuition and to actually believe that you can get there with it, right? Because it's just that voice. Right? But again, when you think about those people who have come into studio and have told you, it just doesn't quite work, right? If you really think about it, they're right. And it's because they know that they're intuitively right. And it's their job as reviewers to figure out how to articulate why they're right. But very quickly they can get a sense for right or wrong, right? You can't prejudge or abandon an idea without letting it mature. You can't say, oh, that's stupid, and move on. Let it mature. It might not be, right? It can also be not useful or inappropriate, right? That does happen, and sometimes you do have to chop it off, right? In terms of nurturing your intuition, don't be afraid to take risks, right? And you do have to spend a little bit of time evaluating what class you're in, who your instructor is, and how they feel about this, okay? So how many people care about their grade in this class, right? I would expect that. Right? That's normal, okay? By the time you're in grad school and you're writing your thesis, you could care less what your grade is in the class. It doesn't make any difference. I don't even know if I can tell you what I got on my thesis. I don't care. It doesn't matter, right? I made it through it. The point being, at your stage in academia, the grade that you get really does matter, right? It matters in a lot of ways. It matters for your GPA. It matters for your transfer, right? It matters as a way of rewarding yourself for how hard you worked in a class, right? I get that. I understand that. Okay? I will tell you right now in this class, I've set up such a net below you that you should never be afraid to take a risk. Right? You can always go back. Let's take an assignment, for example. Right? You can always go back and redo your assignment and do the safe route and replace your grade. Okay? In every one of the exercises, if you take a leap and it doesn't work out, you're still going to get credit because you did it. Right? So there's two ways in the class that you can just take all the leaps you want and you'll never get punished for it. Okay? So I want you to do this. I want you to push yourself. I want you to take these leaps. Okay? Now in some studios, they may not want you to take the leaps, or you might not be as successful taking the leaps. But the more times you do it, the more confidence you'll have in, I can fly. Right? And maybe just once you will. Right? And it will be extraordinarily rewarding. Okay? Expect the unexpected. Don't overanalyze it. Right? As soon as you start analyzing it, it becomes rational, not that other floating thing out there. And record your thoughts, right? You wake up with this. This is great. It happens, right, sometimes in the middle of the night, right? And you just wake up and you have to draw. I don't know, maybe it hasn't happened to you yet, right? It will, okay? Or you're in the shower and you're like, I got to dry off my hand because I got to draw. Like, it's there. I got it, right? Anyway, so elevate your design. So I love this quote. This is the greatest way to end this kind of a lecture, right? In the design process, there are things that you think about rationally. There's those that you learn about and those that you're looking for. And then there's this most interesting part that you cannot be rational about. You just feel it for some strange reason. Okay? If you feel right, it will fit into your concept perfectly, and it'll make it more interesting and unique. Right? I think this is a really good way of kind of summing this up. It's a gut feeling, right? And you have to pursue that gut feeling with all your passion. Okay, so we're going to move into InDesign. Hold on for a second while I switch over here. Okay, so we're switched over. And one of the challenges about this class is that we have to move through software so fast, right? There are certainly classes about Photoshop that you work in Photoshop the whole semester, right? Or InDesign. You work in InDesign the whole semester. This class really isn't designed to do that. It's designed to give you what I believe are the absolute essential skills for you to succeed in the world of architecture. And so we cover a lot of different things, and we try to weave them all together. And so today marks the point where we break from the world of Photoshop and we move into the world of InDesign. But I think it's really important that you understand that just because we switched from Photoshop into InDesign doesn't mean that you can forget everything you know about Photoshop and never touch the program again, right? It's actually quite the opposite. I'm going to assume from this moment forward that anytime that your images need Photoshop, you're going to go back into Photoshop and process them in Photoshop and then use them in InDesign, right? So it's much more of a building block, not a, hey, we finished this one section, now we can move into this other section, right? And you will see that I will try my best as we go forward to weave things together. So we'll move from InDesign, we'll move into Illustrator, right? The things that we do in Illustrator will inform the stuff that we did in InDesign, right? We'll move from Illustrator and we'll go into AutoCAD. We'll talk about AutoCAD for a while, and then we'll take AutoCAD back into Illustrator, right? Then we'll go back and we'll pick up some AutoCAD, maybe some Illustrator, and we'll put it into SketchUp. And then we'll take some SketchUp files and we'll put them back into Photoshop, right? So we'll continue doing these circles, right, as you start to learn how these things integrate. So it's really important that you not forget what we've already learned and continue moving forward. So let's start in InDesign. Photoshop's always easy to find because it's right here in the menu. InDesign sometimes we have to dig a little bit more for. So if I go into my All Programs list and I go to Adobe Design Standard CS6, I'm going to pick Adobe InDesign CS6. And that's going to open up the Adobe InDesign program. Now, one of the things that's important that I'll point out right now is that if you have a laptop or you have a home computer that has the Adobe Creative Cloud application on it, thus far, you've been working in Photoshop, you save your Photoshop file, you bring it into the lab, you open up your Photoshop file, no issue. Okay? InDesign is the absolute opposite. It's the worst. Okay? If you open an InDesign file in Creative Cloud, you cannot open it on one of these lab computers anymore. Right? There is one workaround. You can save it or export it as an IDML file, and that'll let you go back in time. But it's a very chunky process. And unfortunately, Adobe has just done this to us. And it's always been that way in InDesign. So be aware of those version differences. Right? Make sure that you either save it as an IDML or just bring your laptop and keep working on the Creative Cloud. Okay? What we're learning doesn't matter which program you use. Right? It'll work in either program. But it's important to be aware that you can't go backwards in InDesign. Okay, so when I open InDesign for the first time, I get this little splash screen that pops up, and it gives me a really easy access to create a new document. And so you notice that under Create New, I have Document, Book, or Library. Right? Most of the time, Document is sufficient for anything that we need to make. Even if we're making, say, a portfolio, generally speaking, Document is plenty sufficient. Right? So we'll go ahead and click on Document. And that brings up this new document window that's available. And there's a bunch of options that are here by default that I'm going to walk you through. So first thing, it says Document Preset Default. Okay? If I had this on my home computer, I might have some presets of things that I do over and over again. Maybe it's an 11 by 17 setup with certain margins. Maybe it's 8.5 by 11 that I use for typing out all of my pages or something. Right?
Now, for us, there's actually nothing listed here because these are the lab computers and there isn't anything. So that's fine. Okay? Below that, we have something called intent. Right? Almost always the intent out of InDesign is print. Right? This is essentially going to change the color space of what we're working in. If we were doing something for the web or publishing an ebook or something, we'd pick one of these other options. For most part, you're always going to pick print because it's always going to be the end output. You make a portfolio, you're going to print it. You make a big presentation board for your 220 class, you're going to print it. Right? That's almost always the option, so we're going to select print. When we come down here, we have an option for number of pages. This would be if I was creating a multi-page document. Right? Now, of course, I can add pages later. So generally, I just leave it set to 1, and I add as many pages as I need to after the fact. Right? But if you knew you were doing multiple pages, you could add them ahead of time. The other thing is there's a checkbox right here for something called facing pages. Right? Facing pages is essentially like a book. Right? You open it, and the page has content on the left and content on the right of those two pages. Right? So we get a spread. Right? Magazine the same way. Right? If you were doing, say, your history paper and you wanted them all on the same side of the page, right, you'd uncheck this box for facing pages, and you'd have a continuous stream of pages, right, without a fold, right? So I'm going to, for what we're doing today, we're doing an album cover, so it doesn't really matter whether it's facing or not because it's only one page. But for the practice, I'll uncheck facing pages, right? We come down here, we have page size. It's currently set to letter. There are some presets. 11 by 17 is called tabloid, right? If you needed an 11 by 17. We're actually going to use the compact disc size for today. Now, when I change to compact disc, you see that the units for my width and height changed, right? Now, this is 28p 4.157. Okay? Does that mean anything to you? Probably not. Okay? This is a unit called a pica. That's a graphic design unit, right, that graphic designers use. Now, most of us are going to be architects or architecture majors as we go forward, and we're going to work in feet and inches in all likelihood. So one of the tricks about this is, let's say I did want an 8.5 by 11 page or an 11 by 17 page, right? InDesign recognizes that as well. So if I said I want it to be 17 IN by 11 IN, right, it converts to the pica unit from the standard imperial unit. Okay? So be aware that we can do that. And notice that the page size switched to tabloid, so it knew that that's what I was after. Anyway, I'm going to come back to compact disc. Sorry, not business card. We do have an orientation. If I wanted it landscape or portrait, the disc is square, so it doesn't make any difference which one we pick. Okay? Then we come down here. We have presets for columns and gutter widths. If we wanted to, we'll talk about what those are in a little bit more in 2 lectures. And then we come down to margins. For today, we're not worried about printing anything, so let's set our margins to 0. So I'm going to type in 0 in the first field. Now, there's this little button that has a little chain link next to it. That means that if I press Tab or I click in the next field, it will adjust all of the fields to 0. So they're all the same value. Right? If I wanted different margins, I could uncheck that and break the chain and then type in different values for each of the margins. We don't want any margins, so they're all at 0. And then I'll go ahead and say OK. And this then creates the page for me to work on in InDesign. Okay? The page is represented by this border. There's a skinny line at the top and on the left side, and there's kind of a fatter line on the bottom and on the right, as if there was a little bit of a drop shadow to it. That is your piece of paper, so to speak. Okay? So let's talk about the interface of InDesign. It looks shockingly similar to Photoshop. Made by the same company, it should look similar. Okay? At the top, we have our traditional menu structure. Few of the menus are the same, file and edit, right? But some of these others are different. Right? They'll have to do, say, when we're working in type, we'll have a bunch of stuff dealing with type in here. Or objects, a bunch of stuff dealing with individual objects. We'll talk about what those are in a little bit. Below the standard menus up above, we have the ribbon that is contextually aware. So depending on what command you have active, this ribbon is going to change, just like it does in Photoshop, to give you options related to the particular thing that you're doing. So for example, if I pick the T for text, right, the ribbon at the top changes and gives me a bunch of information about text. Okay? I'm going to go back to the arrow for right now, and I get information about selecting. Okay? On the left column here, I have information, or I have a variety of tools that I can work with. Right? We're going to concentrate today using the frame tool, which is available here, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The other thing we'll use is the text tool, which is the T. Right? And I also want to point out down here, there are two squares. One square has a red slash through it, and one square looks like a little outline of black, a little black square with nothing in the center. Okay? These are two different colors. The square with the red line through it is my what's called a fill color. Right? So the body of the object is that color. Okay? When it has a red slash through it, it means that it's transparent. Right? But I could specify a particular color for my object. The other color is called a stroke color or an outline color. Okay? InDesign calls it a stroke color, but sometimes it's easier to understand it as an outline. Right? And that would be the line that goes around the particular object. Right? And that can have a different color or the same color. Okay? So we've talked a little bit. This is our page. Notice that I have some rulers that are set up here. Right? These rulers are in that unit called a pica, which doesn't mean anything to me. Okay? I can switch the rulers really easily into something I understand by right-clicking in this little crosshair in the upper corner and switching from picas to inches. Right? Now, when I switch to inches, this looks much more normal to me. Okay? Notice, though, that 0 starts at the edge of the page, not somewhere over here. I have 0, and then I go negative and positive. I also have 0, and I go negative and positive. Right? So I have two different directions starting at this upper left corner, right, for my rulers. Okay? As I come over here, at the very top, I have something called Essentials. My guess is that you guys have it saying Essentials. It might say something else, but Essentials is what it means, Essentials. These are workspaces. So if, for example, like next class, we're going to be working in typography, I might switch to the typography workspace, which opens up a bunch of other windows, right, relating to dealing with type. Okay? If I was dealing, say, instead kind of within a digital publishing realm, creating an ebook, I might switch to the digital publishing set, and I get different options available there. Okay? Advanced sometimes is useful. It gives us an advanced set of options. Okay? I'm going to go back to the Essentials for right now. Okay? On the right side here, I have what are called windows. And they're kind of nestled in these little drawers. But if I click on any one of them, I get a little pop-up window that gives me information about this particular window. So the first one here is Pages. Right? And if I click on Pages, I see that I have one page. It's numbered page 1, and it's kind of highlighted in this light bluish color. Right? That's the page that I'm currently drawing on. And for today, we're doing just one page, so that's perfect. Okay? Above this is something called a master, and we'll talk about what a master is as we go forward in the class. Okay? Below that, I have layers. Oops. Sorry about that. I accidentally dragged it out. I have layers. Right? And we see that if I click on layers, I have a layer called layer 1. Okay? Now, layers in InDesign and in Illustrator work differently than layers in Photoshop. So layers in Photoshop, it's essentially one object per layer in Photoshop. Right? So we place an image onto a scene, it makes a layer. That's the only object that exists on that layer. Okay? In the world of InDesign, or in the world of Illustrator, you can have multiple objects on a layer. Right? Lots of little pieces on one layer, lots of little pieces on the other layer. The layers work the same way, though, in that layers that are on top of other layers end up with objects that are on top of other objects. Okay? So it can be useful to play with the layers. We won't deal with layers today, but I at least like to introduce the concept of layers existing. So then we move down into another window called Links. Right? And this brings up something that's very critical to understand about InDesign. And that is that InDesign, when we bring an image in, say a photograph, right? Maybe it's the background photograph for today's album cover, it is not embedded in the file itself. Right? So that image is not saved with the InDesign file. It's a link. It's a reference to the original file. So we have the original file that's the photograph, and we have a link to it in InDesign, and we get a preview of what it looks like. but we don't get the actual file. When we go to print this particular page, or we go to export it to JPEG, say to post to the course website, InDesign goes out and says, where's that original file? Let me get the resolution I need from that file, and I'll put it into my final product. Right? This is done because InDesign can deal with very complicated, large drawings. Right? Maybe it's a big presentation board. Maybe it's a 100-page book. Right? I had a friend who used to be a writer for Money Magazine back in New York in the Times building, and or the Time Warner, or whatever it is. Anyway, I went and visited her, and her whole Money Magazine was laid out in InDesign. Right? She didn't do the work. She was a writer for it, but when she submitted her work, it got placed into a master InDesign file. Her work was just linked in, right, to the layout of the InDesign file that was this whole magazine. Okay? So it can work for very large-scale projects in addition to this one single album cover that we're doing. Okay? The links menu is where you see these links, and if you have a problem, you might get a question mark next to it. Right? If you need to update a particular file, you might get a little yellow triangle next to it. Okay? And those links will show up. I'll bring that back as we go a little bit forward so you can see it today. Below that, we have something called stroke. This is what the outline color looks like, and or the thickness of the outline, etc. We'll cover this more in depth as we go forward. We also have a color picker, such that we can pick a color. It is in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which is key. The easiest way to think of this is it's like toners in a laser printer. Right? We have these 3 colored toners. The combination of the colors make a particular color. We'll talk about colors in far more detail at like lectures 15 or 17 or something like that down the road, or 115 or 117. Swatches are just saved colors that we can work on later on. So now that we have kind of the basic layout of what's going on in an InDesign file, now it's time to actually bring in some content. Right? And so we bring in content similar to how we did it in Photoshop, where we go to the File menu and we go to Place. Right? Now, before I do this album, I actually need to create or find the image that I'm going to use. And so I also have to decide on what artist I'm going to pick. So for the fun of it, I'm going to pick Garth Brooks as my artist. And I might need to do a search for something that could be the background of his next album. Right? So given that he's a country artist, maybe I'll type in something like farm. Right? And we'll look for something that looks kind of interesting and farm-like. Right? Maybe this one. It's kind of different. Right? And so I like this. We'll go ahead and save it. And because where this file is stored is important, I do want to make sure that I go find the file and copy it and put it on my flash drive inside a folder that is for this particular exercise. Whoops. Right? I'll put it right here. There it is. Okay? If I leave that file on the desktop and the computer restarts, right, I'll have to go back and find that original image again. Because remember, it's just linked, not embedded. Okay, so we'll come back here. And if I go to File and then Place, and then I go to my flash drive and I find, right, the image, and I click Open, right, I'll get a little thumbnail of what the image looks like, and I'll be able to insert it in the upper left corner, right, of wherever I want the image to go. Okay? Now there's a problem here, and that is that if I click on my page, let's say I wanted it to be right there on the corner, right, I get a really, really big version of this image. Right? It actually doesn't even fit on my workspace. It's gigantic. Okay? So instead of placing it that way, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on this tool that is a rectangle with an X on it, which is called a frame. And the frame is essentially an empty object that I can place any other object into. Okay? In the context today, we're going to place an image into it, but next class we'll place text into it. So we'll reference a text file, like a Word file, and we'll put that in. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and draw, right, this shape, and I can place my image into this shape. Okay? I'd actually like to adjust it first. I'm going to make it the same size as my whole album so that the image is that large. Okay? And so I'm going to go ahead with this object selected, So I'm going to have to click on it so that's selected. You can see I have the little grips in the corners, which means it's selected. And I'm going to go up to the File menu, and I'll go to Place. Okay? And then I'll pick that same image, and I'll go ahead and say Open. And this time, instead of being a gigantic image, it's still too large, but it's cropped by the frame that I drew. Right? If I drew a different size frame, something like that, and I went to File and then Place, and I dropped an image into it, it would go into that image, or go into that frame. Okay? So it would be nice, however, if I could actually see what the image looked like, okay? Or see the whole image. Okay? So to do that, I'm going to right-click on the image, and I'm going to go to a menu item called Fitting. And this fitting, I have a variety of options. I have Fill Frame Proportionally, Fit Content Proportionally, Fit Frame to Content, Fit Content to Frame, Center Content, right, or Clear Frame Fitting Options. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and click on Center Content first. So when I do that, the center of my image is now in the center of my frame. Okay? Then I'm going to right-click and go back to Fitting, and I'll select the first option, Fill Frame Proportionally. And when I do that, it's going to fill my entire frame, right, in proportion. So it hasn't skewed anything or squished anything, but not because this is square and my photo wasn't square, I don't see the whole image. Right? I can actually double-click, and I can see that this is, in this kind of goldish color, the overall size of the image, and this is only the part that I see. Right? I can actually drag it and move it over, right, and see a different part of my image, right, depending on what part I wanted to see. Maybe that's the way that I want to see it. If instead, right, I right-click and I go to Fitting. Oops, sorry, I have to select it. Right-click, go to Fitting, and I say Fit Content Proportionally. Right? Now I'm going to see the whole image, right, with a bar at the top and the bottom. So it's no longer filling my entire frame, but I'm going to see the whole image, okay, which may or may not be advantageous for you. Okay? If I right-click and go to Fitting and instead say Fit Frame to Content, the frame's going to get larger such that it goes around the whole of my image. Okay? The last option under, Fitting, right, Fit Content to Frame, is going to ignore the proportions of the image and just squish it to fit inside the frame, whatever it takes to squish it. Okay? So it's no longer going to be in its original aspect ratio. Right? It might get skinnier or whatever. So generally, the most common option, right, is either of the first two, Fill Frame Proportionally or Fit Content Proportionally. My guess is it's Fill Frame Proportionally, right, in all likelihood. So now I have my image. Right? If I went to this links window, we now see that I have a link that exists. There's my file. If I were to click on it, it tells me information about it. Right? I can make this a little bit bigger. Right? And it'll tell me when it was last updated, what size it is, right, where it is, etc. So it's a referenced file. So now let's say I want to go ahead and write some text. So I'll use the text tool, the T. And text in InDesign, I need a box. So I can click and drag a box, and it'll show up kind of as that blue outline. And then I can go ahead and type in it. So let's say I type Garth Brooks. I'll go ahead and select Garth Brooks. It's really hard to see because it's black, right? So it's also small. So let's start by making it larger. Maybe we'll try 60 point. Okay, maybe that was a little too big. I can use the up and down arrows here to shrink it point by point. There it is. Or I could actually type in a particular value. Right? There are presets at certain jumping intervals that you're probably more familiar with. But again, I could type in any value that I want, even a decimal point number. Okay, if I look at this ribbon, I have some other options. Like here, I have justification. I could be right justified instead of left justified. Right? And I may want to change the color. So right now I have black text. If I were to deselect here, you can see that I have black text. Let me resize this box slightly. We'll drop it right down to here. I have black text. It's a little hard to read. Let me go back in. I double-click, and I select it. And then maybe I'll turn it to white. So if I click on this little T, right? Remember that used to be just a square. Now it's a T because it's text. If I double click on it, I can then change the color from black, which is 100% K, right, to white, which would be 0. Right? I could also move the slider to this upper corner and move that slider until I get white. Okay? So I'll go ahead and say OK. And now what was black is now white. Now maybe it would show up better if I put it in this upper corner. Right? Yeah, it's a little bit better. Okay? I have the ability to change the font, so I could select the text and then change the font to be any one of the other fonts that's available out here. Right? Sometimes when you change the font, it gets a little bit too big. Maybe I have to drop the size down. Right? Maybe it needs to be a little bit bigger. I don't know, something like that. Okay? So I'm able to make these rather easy text adjustments. Okay? Now maybe I want to include, maybe this needs a parental advisory or something on it. Not that Garth Brooks would necessarily need one, but I could do a Google image search. Maybe parental advisory, right? And I could pick one of these, parental advisory logos or something, right? Let me go ahead and view the image, and let me go ahead and save the image as, and I'm going to save it to, it's going to be a JPEG image, and I'll save it to, right, my folder. We'll come back here. Again, I'll create a little frame, maybe something like that. And I'll go to File, Place. I'll drop my parental advisory. It's too big, so I'm going to right-click, go to Fitting, and Fill Frame Proportionally. There it is. Looks a little bit clipped, but it's about the right size. So I'll right-click, and I'll go to Fitting, and this time I'll say Fit Frame to Content, so that I get the whole piece. Okay? If it still needed to be adjusted in scale, I can click on this Free Transform tool. It's like a rectangle of dots, and I could then adjust the size. Again, I probably need to hold down Shift to keep it in proportion. Maybe something like that. So if I look over here, now I have the parental advisory JPEG, and I have the image JPEG. Okay? So let's say that I wasn't quite happy with this image, and I wanted it to be black and white instead. Okay? If I go find it on my flash drive, there it is. Let me go ahead and open it in Photoshop. And so here's an example of don't forget Photoshop, right? There it is. I'm going to convert this image to black and white. Let me go to Select, or excuse me, Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. Check the box for monochrome. And again, I would go through and I would pick which one is the right preset filter. I don't know. We'll just go with that for right now. Right? When I'm done, I'll go ahead and just go to File and Save. And it's going to overwrite my JPEG, right, with the black and white version. And I'm doing this on purpose. Okay? So now, if I go back to InDesign and I look at my links window, see how I have this link still showing in color, but it has a little yellow triangle with an exclamation mark on it. Right? That means that this file has been updated outside of the world of InDesign. So if I double click on the triangle, right, it'll go get the new file, which is the black and white version. Okay? So the linked file will update, which is great when you're doing this kind of work and you have iterations. You put something in, you do a new version, it's a little bit better, you put it in. Right? Maybe you have a Word file and it's wrapped all the way through a document. You can replace that text. Right? Anyway, the other thing that does happen is if we look closely at this particular image, see how it's very, very pixelated? Right? What we're seeing is just a preview of the actual image. If I want to see it in its sharper format, I can right-click on the image. I can go to Display Performance and say High Quality Display, and I'll get the sharper image. Right? This image happened to be a little bit blurry. Maybe I picked the wrong image. Right? I could actually select it and go to File, Place, and I could pick a different image. All right, I'll pick this one from earlier today, and we can see that that's much sharper as an image.
If I go back to my display performance and I go back to typical display, we'll get the pixelated version. The advantage of these pixelated versions is it doesn't slow down InDesign nearly as much. So when you have really large files, right, you don't really need the full resolution version. You just kind of need a preview to know where it fits and whatever. So in this case, the parental advisory really doesn't work there. So I should move it. Maybe I'll move it down there because it doesn't work in this composition. Right? Likewise, this doesn't work as well up in the sky. Maybe it needs to come down here to the bottom. Right? And maybe the parental advisory actually needs to go up here. I don't know. Whatever. Oops. Sorry. There. Right? Something like that to work better with this particular image. The point is, I can arrange it without having the high resolution version, right, which speeds up InDesign. Okay, so when I'm all done today, I'm going to save two things. One is going to be the INDD file. So I'll go to File, Save, and this will save an InDesign CS6 document. And I'll click Save. And then I also want to save a JPEG to post to the course website. So I'll go to File and then Export. And under Format or Save As Type, the default is always PDF because that's generally what you produce. But for this class, since we're posting it online, we want a JPEG instead. I'll pick JPEG. I'll click Save. Couple options here. Quality is maximum. Resolution should be 300. Yours might be 72 and medium by default. Okay. When I'm done, I'll click Export, and it'll create a high-resolution JPEG of this particular album cover. Okay. Any questions about InDesign? Not yet? Okay. I'll turn you loose to build your album cover today. Next class, we're going to talk about typography, so fonts, kerning, tracking, really working with the details of fonts. And then we'll move on Wednesday next week into a far more detailed discussion about graphic design. What are column intervals? What are flow lines, etc., for establishing graphic design? Okay?